connection to BPF. Ken Sehesta visited Vancouver 20 years ago, trying to drum up some interest in Vancouver, and still struggling to drum up a little interest. Bob and Judy Dahl have still been working at it for many, many years, to their credit. So it's good to be here, and it's good to know we're in Spokane next time. And hopefully we can have a few more Vancouverites present at that one. My colleague Tamara Ward-Belliski also has served on the board of BPF, and she's in Mexico right now with Sacred Canopy, teaching kids stories of the Bible and having them present them artistically in their neighborhood there in Mexico right now as we speak. And she sends her greetings to everyone here as well. Yeah, Canadians and Americans. Canadians and Americans, it's really heartwarming to see how much you like Canada. And to hear all the affirmations that get, it's not always true. Sometimes get together with Americans and Canadian Americans, we kind of, jostle about whose country is superior or better culture. And so, story told about two guys, one American, one Canadian, who were arguing about their culture. And the Canadian guy, he says, you guys, we kind of have you beat. We have universal health care. And we have hockey. Those are the two things that unite us in Canada, hockey and healthcare. And the American says, who cares about hockey? I mean, really. And he says, A really is a good way to refer. It's a good interjection to use the word A. And so the American guy comes back and says, no, you Canadians. He says, you're so polite. You wouldn't even tell each other you were walking off a cliff. You're so polite to each other. And that's true. Canadians are really timid about speaking up. But Americans have courage. A lot of times where Canadians often lack courage, and I appreciate that about Canada. So these two guys are arguing. They're arguing so much so that they end up driving right into a tree, and they both die. And they end up going before God, and they want to get this settled once and for all. And so they come before God, and they're ushered in. They bring this question that says, whose culture and language is superior? Expression of English is superior. The Canadians or Americans? And God greets them, and she says, Buenos dias, señores. My special welcome to Dahlia and Wanda, by the way. So just a little bit about myself. I have been at Grandview Calvary Baptist Church in Lake Will, started when I was 10 at the church. And I am married to Mary for 28 years, and we have 3 boys, Thomas, 23, Taylor, 21, and Mitchell, 17. During that time, we've been there. We have lived in community with other people. I'll tell you a little bit about that story. And it's been a good, long journey of coming to a community that was ready to fold up and slowly working together with everybody there, developing a community that really does inhabit this neighborhood and seeks to live out the vision of the kingdom of God there in a number of different ways. What I want to do this week is a few things. I want to try and spark your imagination for ways that we can live out the kingdom vision in our own neighborhoods. I want to talk about 4 themes that have been essential in our own community journey. Themes of community, hospitality, justice, and confession. And I want to tell them against the backdrop of a little bit of description and analysis of our culture, because I think it's important to name what we are up against when we seek to live out these important practices in our communities. Secondly, I want to tell you some stories from our community. I think stories are helpful. I've already really appreciated the stories from Sherry and Michael Ray and some of other storytellers that we've heard thus far. I think it's really helpful to spark our imagination to hear one another's stories. Walter Brueggemann graciously wrote on the back of my book, he says, the current crisis in the church leads us to fall back on specific narratives so that we may learn what is true and transferable from one community of discipleship to another. I think that's true. I think we need to tell each other our stories so that we can find encouragement to live out this vision of justice and peace in our world. I think, too, that it takes time. It takes time to live out the vision of peace. Stanley Hauerwas and Jean Vanier write in a beautiful little book they've written together, saying that peace takes time. And I want to tell you a little bit about the little incremental steps that we've taken along the way that I hope will be helpful for you in your own communities in thinking of the incremental steps that you can take. Thirdly, I want to help us hear from each other. So at the end of my talk, I'm going to invite you to write on your piece of paper that you have there a response to what I'm talking about, maybe what else you've heard through this conference each night. And we're going to put these responses on some boards, weave them together, and I hope that they will be kind of a tapestry that will tell some of the story of what God's Spirit has been leading us towards during this week. So I'll just give you a little hint that what I'm going to invite you to respond to tonight is, I hear the Spirit moving me to extend God's welcome by. And then we're going to respond to that with a piece of paper. So you can start to be thinking and letting your imaginations grow around that.
Could you repeat that, please?
I can repeat that. I hear the Spirit moving me to extend God's welcome by. I was intrigued by the theme verse when Ladane told me for the conference, because I know that vision in Acts chapter 4 has been influential in the history of the church, in this idea of this vision of community and hospitality. It's inspired the Benedictines, Francis of Assisi, Jesus People USA, new monastic communities around North America today. It's been an influential passage in spurring others' imagination for living in community. But I think it's important to say that there are forces working against us when it comes to trying to live into a vision of community. That's especially true in Vancouver. Vancouver has less than 3% of people who are involved in any regular way in a faith community, one of the most secularized cities in North America. And I often, if I am speaking in American audience, I like to say that we are your future. It's likely that this is the way it's going to be as we go along together in North America. So what does that mean? To try and form community in a place that's becoming more and more separated from the transcendent vision. It's also true that there's a big study done in North America. Vancouver, right, said that two of the biggest issues in our city are loneliness and isolation. And so you can see that people desire community, and yet we resist it in all sorts of ways. So what are we up against when it comes to forming community? Over the last 1,500, especially 500 years, we have moved towards a way of conceiving human life from what it was primarily a corporate identity to an individual identity. That's not going to come as any surprise to you. But what is important to realize is that it wasn't always this way. It used to be different. There are other ways of living humanly where we see ourselves in more of a corporate identity. A number of people, including Brad Gregory at Notre Dame University and Canada's own Charles Taylor, one of the foremost social philosophers today, have shown how this movement from a corporate identity to an individual identity has taken firm hold among us. And so that we all see ourselves now as kind of the center, the locus of life. That's how we tend to live, and especially so that move towards individualism has deepened in the last 50 years. Harvard sociologist Robert Putnam, in his famous study, Bowling Alone, studies American society from 1960 to the year 2000. His study shows how the social bond, social capital, has decreased 10% in each of those decades. There's all sorts of reasons for that decrease in social connections. Urban sprawl, men and women joining the paid workforce, the primary one, though, being the introduction of television and the effects that had. But the result is that it's more difficult to form community because of those reasons. And as sociologist Zygmunt Bauman puts it, the decline of community is self-perpetuating. Once it takes off, there's fewer and fewer stimuli to stem the disintegration of human bonds and seek ways to tie again what has been torn apart. So once community starts to crumble, it's just hard to pull it back together. And we all know what that is like. So the result is that many of us form a circle, a small circle of a few friends. and that becomes our community. So much different than this passage we heard tonight, what it is to form community with the vision of Jesus. Well, how do we respond to that? Well, one thing we do is we don't give up, because we know that there is a God who desires to form people into community. From the beginning of Jesus' public ministry, he formed people into small cells wherever he went that would invigorate this movement after he was gone, after the climactic moment he anticipated when he would confront the powers of Rome and Judaism. And these cells would become centers, pockets of welcome and hospitality for people of many languages, let alone, and especially for the most vulnerable in society. Seems to me that if we are going to recover Jesus' vision for justice in this world, we will need to learn again and teach people very intentionally again what it means to live and be together in community, in flesh and blood communities. This parable that Judy read for us tonight is one that has really inspired and directed our community in our church in the formation of community. But I don't know about you, every time I hear this parable, I feel challenged by it. I feel challenged by it even tonight as I listen to it and think about some of the changes in our own lives that are happening. How do we live this parable out? Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, who is becoming a friend of mine and general editor of my book, says that when he speaks across America, whether it's liberals or conservatives, people tell him that they think it would be really hard to live what Jesus actually did, to live out the way of Jesus. This parable, I think, is a case in point. I mean, let's look at the parable a little bit. I want to notice a few things about it tonight. The host in Jesus' parable is planning this great feast, this huge party. And Jesus' numerous stories about parties and the many parties that are hosted were more than just an excuse to have a good time. They were one way that Jesus announced that God's restoring rule was taking place among them, that it was already taking root through his own life and ministry. The Old Testament prophets regularly describe the return of God in the language of a feast. Think of Isaiah 25. The Lord will make for all peoples a feast of rich food and well-aged wines. He will wipe away the tears from all faces, and the disgrace of his people he will take away from the earth. It will be said on that day, look, this is our God. This is our God. We have waited for him for us that he might save us. This is the Lord for whom we have waited. Let us be glad and rejoice in his salvation. So this parable that Jesus tells is more than a weekend shindig. This is a parable about what God's world will look like when God again becomes the leader of this world. This is what it would look like when heaven comes on earth. So the host in the parable makes this invitation to this party. And it's a typical kind of respectable invitation list that the host sends out. But all the respectable people are busy on this night. No one shows up. Everyone has an excuse. And it turns out that they are lousy excuses. They are even insulting to the guests. Kenneth Bailey, an Middle Eastern scholar, shows clearly how people wouldn't buy a house or buy land or buy oxen without going to check it out and to make sure that it's adequate. So these excuses that they give to the reasons they can't come for this party are really that. They're just excuses. They're insulting to the guest, to the host rather. And the last one about being married, says I just got married, I can't come to the party, is a bit closer to the truth, and it actually gets at Jesus' radical call to the people, saying that, it's not just about your family that matters here. There's more to being community together. So Jesus' point in the parable is pretty clear. The people who claim to be God's friends are not behaving like his friends. Jesus is enacting God's welcome in his own extravagant banquets. And instead of receiving his welcome and sharing in his welcome to the excluded, these respectable folks make only feeble excuses. They're preoccupied with their own wealth and power. They insult the God who invited them to his banquet in the first place. But God isn't waiting around for them. God spreads the invitation far and wide to the poor, to the Gentiles, their enemies, which is likely who Jesus is referring to when he tells the servant to welcome people from the roads and the country lanes. The parable makes clear that in Jesus, God's extravagant banquet will have an invitation list that stretches to the farthest corners of society and to all the nations. The welcome of God is almost unbelievable in its width. And the guests themselves, they can hardly believe it. They have to be compelled to come in. And it's hospitality offered without requiring something in return, as Judy said, as she read the scripture. Christine Pohl puts it this way. She says, biblical hospitality differed from ancient hospitality in Roman society, and that it was offered without thought for gain or reciprocity. Without thought for gain or reciprocity. This is the character of God. And as theologian, the good Lutheran theologian Christopher Stendhal puts it, wherever God's kingdom is, there is welcome. Wherever God's kingdom is, there is welcome. Let me tell you a few ways that this parable has shaped our own practice of hospitality and community. It's parables like this one that have moved us to open our church building for meals on Thursday nights and for people to stay overnight. It's a parable like this one in particular that has moved us to start Kinbrace, housing for refugee claimants, where they can stay and get established in our neighborhood. It's motivated people to welcome many people from many nations to be a part of our community together. And great to see some folks from Burma here in our midst. It's been a part of our story too, to welcome some Korean and Chin folks into our community. I want to tell you a little bit about how some of these things develop, because again, I think it's the process that's helpful, because you're not going to go back to your communities and do the same things we do, but I think hearing stories of how other people do things can motivate us all to and imagine what we might do in our own communities. So take our meal on Thursday night, our Out of the Cold meal it's called. I was at a meeting at a neighborhood gathering where people from our neighborhood gathered together once a month to talk about our community's problems and challenges. And someone said to me, what are the churches and temples and mosques doing about people on the street? There's more and more people on the street in our neighborhood. And I said, nothing that I'm aware of. And so I went back to our community that Sunday, shared that story, and said, like, if there's anybody that wants to talk about this, let's meet after our worship service and talk about it together. About 15 people gathered. We decided to do some research, and about 6 months later, after I remember Gordon, who was opposed to this because we thought it might wreck our building, we finally talked it through with Gordon and opened up on Thursday nights, welcoming people to be among us in a meal. That was 13 years ago. In the last year, the meal has shifted to more of a community kitchen, where the guests are the ones making the meal and inviting their friends from the street to this meal. Now, anyone who's been part of offering a free meal knows that you can get stuck there, and that charity is not the same thing as justice. But one of the benefits